There and back again. A Goggins Tale, Part 10, to Helm's Deep. As dawn broke over the ridges of Edoras, a horn sounded, low and mournful, echoing across the plains. Goggins rose with a weary sigh, his muscles aching, but his spirit as undiminished as ever. This bitch hard as nails, he thought, recalling the night with the Lady of Rohan. She'd met him with a fierceness he hadn't expected. Nonetheless, she still winced as she walked, having overestimated her prowess. "My lord," she bowed slightly, smiling as she hobbled from his quarters. Outside, the gathering for departure to Helm's Deep had begun. Théoden's people, the women, children, and elderly, were all ushered into the caravan, their faces full of fear and uncertainty. The ride was slow. The caravan wound through the hills, moving cautiously toward the ancient stronghold. By midday, the caravan halted for a short break. Goggins sat heavily on a patch of grass, pulling out a small flask to sip from. He looked up to see the lady approaching, holding a bowl of stew she'd made. "Lord Goggins," she said softly, offering it to him with a shy, hopeful smile. He took the bowl with a raised eyebrow, sniffing at it cautiously. One taste, and he grimaced. "The fuck did you do to this fish? This shit's nasty as fuck," he barked. The bitterness of the stew was like nothing he'd had before. "The orc food I tried tasted better than this shit." Eowyn's face fell, her cheeks flushing. "I am sorry, my lord," she murmured, looking away. Across the camp, Eomer overheard and frowned, casting a reproachful look at Goggins. Before he could say anything, Aragorn stepped in, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "The words of Lord Goggins may appear harsh, but there is wisdom in them," Aragorn said, in a calming voice. "Would you congratulate a child for walking upon the wrong path, Lord? Nay, for how else will the child learn?" Eomer clenched his jaw but nodded reluctantly. Aragorn turned in Goggins' direction and gave a small smile. "He merely gives much-needed instruction. Much I have learned from the Lord Goggins since our chance meeting at the inn at Bree. Already he has saved the members of my company from calamity many times. Though we may not understand his methods, be assured, the shadow may already have overcome us if it were not for him. You are fortunate, Lord, that you did not anger him, for then, surely, the doom would be upon you." As the caravan resumed its journey toward Helm's Deep, Aragorn rode beside Goggins, casting a glance at Eomer, who trailed close behind, listening curiously. Aragorn spoke gravely. "Our enemies are vast and merciless, my Lord Goggins. There are two towers casting their shadows upon Middle-earth. One in Isengard, the other in Mordor. Each is commanded by a dark force whose power grows beyond reckoning. Together, they—" "Hold up," interrupted Goggins, his eyes narrowing. "We talking about the two towers here?" "Ain't no fucking way. I remember when they came down." "You have foreseen the fall of the two towers?" gasped Aragorn, bringing his horse to a stop. "Yeah, man, was fucked up what happened. I was there. When the towers fell, the world changed. Al-Qaeda weren't fucking around. Then we had the War on Terror. Shit got real nasty. Then there is a way?" asked Aragorn eagerly. "We must join these valiant soldiers of Al-Qaeda." "What the fuck?" replied Goggins, thoroughly taken aback. "You want to join the jihadis now? If it means destroying the towers and freeing Middle-earth, then I would join with this Al-Qaeda," responded Aragorn solemnly, bowing his head. "You got some issues, brother," responded Goggins. "I remember it like it was yesterday. September the 11th. The world changed that day. But it is only March, and the enemy's strength yet grows," said Aragorn anxiously. Goggins did not respond immediately. He scrutinized the ranger closely for a minute and opted to take the conversation in another direction. "Back home, we had our own motherfucking wormtongues, pissing in our faces and calling it rain. Evil motherfuckers like Sheeny Bush Obama and that bitch Hillary who destroyed the Middle East. The Middle East? Asked Aragorn. It's like your Middle Earth, I suppose, man. It's hot as a motherfucker out there, and they got oil. Aragorn tilted his head, attempting to follow. And how do you defeat them? We didn't. They're still going with their bullshit. Chilling on Epstein's island with the kids. Lord Goggins, interrupted the king, who'd been following the conversation for a while now. What is this island of which you speak? Fuck, thought Goggins, wondering if it was a good idea to enlighten those around him to the nefarious activities of the leaders back at home. He took a long pull from his flask, buying time to think of an appropriate response. Well, we got this bitch called Hillary back in my world, and she's married to a guy who likes them young. He paused and reconsidered his approach. The island is like Mordor, but worse, much worse. Everyone who goes there ends up like that faggot Wormtongue. An island of dread, nodded the king grimly. Actually, they called it Pleasure Island, corrected Goggins quietly before he could stop himself. The king's face contorted in confusion for a moment as he attempted to make sense of the name. A name worthy of the malice and jest of Mordor, smiling their wicked smiles in the face of our suffering, he said. Aragorn frowned. These Wormtongues yet hold power in your lands? How do your people endure such treachery? Goggins scoffed. They trying to make America gay. Who's gonna fight when all the men are pussies? The king shook his head solemnly. Strange are the troubles of your world, Lord Goggins, but they are not so different from ours. I would that your people find peace upon a day. The caravan had been moving steadily toward Helm's Deep when a horn blast rang out from behind them, cutting through the chatter and sending a ripple of fear through the ranks. The king's face grew grim as he lifted his hand, signaling a halt. Goggins instantly snapped to attention, scanning the distant ridges. Let's go, motherfuckers, he bellowed, his voice rolling across the startled caravan. He shot a look at the fellowship, who fell into place like a well-oiled machine. The king rallied his own soldiers. To arms. Warriors with me, all others, follow Eomer to Helm's Deep with haste. The caravan split, warriors forming up under his command as he readied them to defend their kin. As the king's men scrambled into formation, they couldn't help but notice how swiftly the fellowship moved into position, weapons in hand. Goggins, Gimli, Legolas, Aragorn, Boromir, and the hobbits took the lead, dropping low at the crest of the hill. Goggins signaled his fellows, his voice a low command. We take them out here, men. Don't let them near the caravan. The wargs thundered closer, nearly 200 orc-ridden beasts with axes raised and eyes wild. Goggins held his rifle steady. Fire! He Legolas, and the hobbits opened fire, the sharp cracks of rifles and pistols cutting through the air. Orc after orc fell, and their riders were thrown from their mounts as the bullets struck with deadly precision. Théoden and his soldiers watched, spellbound, as the fellowship laid waste to the vanguard with an efficiency they had never seen before. Legolas, with deadly grace, fired shot after shot, each one finding its mark. Even the hobbits, usually gentle-natured, fired their pistols with gritted teeth, taking down their share of orcs. The wargs buckled under the relentless assault, their charge faltering as the front lines dropped to the earth, lifeless. The king stood in awe, his soldiers murmuring in amazement. No one had seen anything like this. Goggins turned back to Théoden and the men of Rohan. All right, bitches. Time to finish the job, he called, giving a gesture in the direction of the remaining enemies. Charge these motherfuckers. The king's face broke into a fierce smile as he raised his sword. Riders of Rohan, to victory! With a mighty roar, Théoden and his men charged down the hill, followed closely by Goggins, Aragorn, and Boromir. Together, they thundered toward the remnants of the enemy. As the roar of the charge filled the air, Goggins surged forward alongside Théoden's men, combat knife in hand, his boots pounding against the rocky terrain as they stormed down the hill. Steel clashed and war cries echoed as the riders of Rohan collided with the scattered orcs, the power of their attack breaking the diminished enemy ranks. But in the frenzy of battle, one of the wargs, lying still on the ground and assumed dead, lifted its head. It lunged, its powerful jaws snapping as it collided into Goggins. He stumbled, and in a sudden twisting motion, the creature rammed him with all its weight. Before Goggins could steady himself, he was pushed back, tumbling over the edge of the cliff into the misty chasm below. As he vanished, a faint motherfucker echoed up from the chasm. The Fellowship, locked in the heat of combat, could only watch in horror as their leader disappeared into the abyss. Aragorn shouted, his voice strained with shock, but there was no time to react. The oncoming orcs pressed closer, forcing them back into the fray. One by one, the Fellowship fought their way to the top of the hill, standing breathless and bloodied, the realization settling heavy over them. After the last orc had fallen, Aragorn, Gimli, Legolas, Boromir, and the hobbits exchanged grim glances, each of them weighed down by the same terrible thought. Goggins, the man who had led them through fire and fury, was gone. With heavy hearts, they made their way back to Théoden, who awaited them with anxious eyes. When he saw the sorrow etched into their faces, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. "Where is Lord Goggins?" Théoden asked quietly. Aragorn bowed his head. He fell, my lord, driven over the cliff in battle." Théoden's shoulders sank as the news settled over him. He lowered his gaze, and the men around him whispered to one another, expressions of shock and grief spreading through the ranks. Though Goggins' ways were strange to them, his strength and unwavering courage had left a deep impression. And for a moment, the hope he had brought them felt fragile, slipping away. "I perceive the weight of your loss," he said, placing a hand upon Aragorn's shoulder. "But now is not the time to mourn, though he was a great man. I must look to the defense of my people." Théoden's gaze drifted down to a small shining object on the ground, and he bent over to pick it up. "I marvel at your weapons, my lord Aragorn," he said, examining the brass bullet casing he had picked up. "These are not of mortal design, King Théoden," responded Aragorn, still weeping at the loss of Lord Goggins. "Hope once again returns with this victory. Would that we had an army of you. As I said in the Golden Hall, a heavily armed battalion of elves, dwarves, and men ride to your aid in Helm's Deep. With their reinforcement, Helm's Deep will be sufficiently manned for a strong defense," reassured Aragorn. "We must go, my lord. There will be more of them if we tarry here long," said one of the king's men at his side. The king nodded, mounting his horse and gesturing to Aragorn with a kind smile to follow. Aragorn looked around at the members of the Fellowship who remained distraught. Gimli and the hobbits wept openly, overwhelmed by grief. "I will miss you, friend Goggins," whispered Frodo. Sam looked down at his ripped arms and bulging biceps in sorrow. "No one's ever cared for us like him." And he wept as Boromir carried him and placed him and Frodo atop a horse. As the weary caravan crested the final hill, Helm's Deep rose before them, nestled in the shadow of the towering cliffs. The men of Rohan rode ahead, their voices lifting in shouts of triumph. Despite the haunting loss of Lord Goggins, there was relief among the people. They had survived without losing a single warrior, a feat beyond their wildest hopes. At the fortress gate, the lady awaited them, her eyes scanning the approaching line of horses and warriors. She searched each face, her gaze slipping past Théoden, Aragorn, Legolas, and even the hobbits, looking for the tall, dark figure of Lord Goggins. As the last of the men rode in, her heart clenched. She turned desperately to Gimli, who dismounted heavily, clutching his axe and wiping away stray tears. "Where's the Lord Goggins?" she asked, her voice trembling. Gimli's shoulders sagged as he looked at her, eyes red-rimmed. "He fell, my lady." For a moment, the lady stood frozen, her face draining of color. Then she let out a sharp wail, a sound of pure anguish that echoed off the walls of Helm's Deep. Her grief was raw, unrestrained as she sank to her knees, overcome. Around her, the people of Rohan turned their heads. Aragorn placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his own face lined with sorrow. "My lady, his sacrifice was not in vain. He has shown us the way. If we can but hold out till September 11th. I will never ride again," she whispered, her voice choked. "He gave his all so that we might stand here today," said Aragorn softly. "We must honor him by standing strong, as he would have wanted." The men of Rohan, too, bowed their heads, murmuring in respect. Théoden raised his hand, gathering their attention. "Lord Goggins was a stranger to our lands, but he defended us with his very life. He has earned a place in the songs of Rohan to be sung for generations. May his name be remembered as a legend of our people, Negroes Moors, the Black Death." "The Black Death," the men chanted. The king then held up his hand, commanding silence. "But now is not the time to mourn. The enemy bears down upon us. We must prepare the defense of Helm's Deep." At that moment, a horn sounded from outside the walls. "That is no orc horn," said Legolas. As the horn echoed off the stone walls of Helm's Deep, a hush fell over the fortress. The Fellowship, the king, and his people rushed to the battlements, their eyes straining into the dim light. Slowly, over the crest of the ridge, a formidable sight emerged, and a ripple of awe passed through those assembled. Before them, in gleaming rows, marched a battalion of 2,000 elves, dwarves, and men, all clad in armor that sparkled with an otherworldly sheen. The armor was unlike any they had seen in Middle-earth. Each plate and helm, each sword and shield bore the mark of meticulous craftsmanship, molded to a design conceived by Lord Goggins himself. The dwarves had forged each piece in fire stoked hotter and longer than tradition allowed, creating armor that looked like something out of legend, layered and impenetrable, reflecting sunlight like polished stone. Helmets bore angular edges, glistening even in the dim light, and with symbols etched in gold, powerful dwarven runes mixed with elven sigils of protection and strength. The soldiers moved as one, a living tide, an unbreakable army. The elves held long, slender rifles in place of bows. Dwarves wielded axes that glinted with newly sharpened edges, hefting them as if they were weightless. And men, now bolstered with superior arms, carried swords and spears. Théoden's face broke into a grin of relief, a hope rekindled that had seemed extinguished mere moments before. He turned to Aragorn, awe etched across his face. "These are the forces you promised?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. "And they come so well armed, like the heroes of old." Aragorn nodded, pride and grief mingling in his gaze as he looked out over the battalion. "Lord Goggins foresaw our need, my lord. He spared no effort, no wisdom, to equip us for what lies ahead. Each soldier was trained by the Lord and is mightier than any elf, dwarf, or man." A quiet murmur spread along the walls of Helm's Deep. Soldiers who had been ready to face the end only moments before now straightened, their weariness momentarily forgotten. Gimli looked on with pride, running a hand over the grip of his axe. Legolas watched the elven contingent, his heart swelling at the sight of his kin. "Would that Lord Goggins were here to see this," Aragorn murmured, his gaze fixed on the battalion, their weapons raised in salute to the defenders on the walls.
Thanks for joining us on this adventure. If you enjoyed the journey and are eager for more wild fan fiction, don't forget to hit that like button, share with your fellow fans, and subscribe for more episodes. And if you're as enchanted by the idea of Middle-earth meeting Hogwarts as we are, make sure to check out our series exploring this magical crossover. Your support brings these worlds to life. Until next time, keep the fantasy alive.